This is Fans on the Run, a podcast made by, for, and about Beatles fans. And now, here's your host, Ethan Alexanian.
Welcome back to the greatest Beatles podcast on earth. Rated number 1 by the New York Times. I've already won a Pulitzer Prize. I'm your host, Ethan Alexanian.
Much better, much better.
Thank you, John. If you haven't already heard from his laughing, we have a guest on, which is usual for this podcast. I don't even know why I said that. All right. God, we have a great guest today. He's a bass guitarist whose resume reads like a who's who of the golden era of classic rock. He's played with the Turtles, Mickey Dolenz, Todd Rundgren, Mitch Ryder, Denny Lane, Felix Cavalier, and this fella you might have heard of by the name of Alan Parsons. He did the theme for What the Fuck with Marc Maron, and he's the co-host of the Radio 418 and Breaking It Down with Jeff and John podcasts, and most importantly, he's a self-described beatard. John Montagna, thanks for coming on.
It's my pleasure, Ethan. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be speaking to Canadian carpet royalty, man. I did some research on your family. I didn't realize, like, this is no. Listen. You think I'm joking around, but I'm dead serious because I one of your shows you mentioned the jingle.
Yeah.
To the commercials, and here in New York we've got a lot of sort of local businesses that would advertise locally, that had their jingles and their commercials that you remember your whole life. We had a place, Coronet, which they did like children's bedroom furniture, and it was owned by a family, and the two brothers would do the commercial together, and the shtick was that they refused to do commercials that were too fancy. We don't want circus acts. No talking orangutan. That was the line in all the commercials. And then, all we have is low prices, and no talking orangutan. And then it would say Coronet, 1111 Old Country Road in Westbury. Those are the kinds of things that you remember your whole life.
Okay,
So
I at least wish my family's jingle was like that, because this is just this kind of high-pitched harmony that you hear as you're driving, and it's like, oh my God, you're the first American guest I've had bring this up to me. This will never leave me, and I will be haunted for the rest of my life.
You're going to be haunted. Dude, growing up an Alexanian is going to carry with it very specific responsibilities, man. It'd be like being related to the Pergament family here in New York or something like that. It's like a paint store. Shop Pergament for your home. Or Kaufman. In New York, we had Kaufman, the carpet experts. We've got it all.
The thing is, with the whole carpet thing, on one hand, I'm really proud of it because, like, my great-grandpa fled Armenia during the genocide and then came to Canada and, made a great life for himself. On the other hand, if it's every day for the rest of your life in school, your friends come up to you and it's like, Alexanians! You want to shoot yourself.
Well, I mean, that is a small price to pay, I think.
For being a living god.
Yeah, listen, man. Now you understand you can imagine what Julian Lennon must have dealt with going to school, or anyone. It's as Frank Zappa once said, my kids are not going to get in trouble because of their first name. It's going to be their last name.
Yeah.
That causes them, you know what I mean? So listen, on the one hand, you have being teased in school. On the other hand, fleeing your home country because there's a genocide going on. So, we all are standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, and we are also made of culture. The things that we heard growing up the songs and the stories that we heard growing up, that we remembered as kids, that's what shapes us. That's what makes us who we are. That's why you and I are talking now from however many thousands of miles apart between Ontario and New York, because of the Beatles. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Not that I'm equating the Beatles with your great grandfather, but I think you get what I'm trying to say.
I mean, I think.
And by the way, I played in Armenia.
What?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Good.
Oh, no.
I was going to say we played a show in Armenia in '09, I think it was. We did do you know who Javan Gasparian is?
I think I've heard the name.
He's an Armenian musician. He's the master of the duduk, which is it's like a flute. It's like a reed instrument made of apricot wood. You would recognize the sound. Do you have the Chaos and Creation in the Backyard album?
Yes.
Okay. The solo on Jenny Wren, that sort of like wind kind of flute, that's a duduk. And okay. Javan Gasparian is he's like the Charlie Parker of the duduk. He's like a world famous Armenian musician. And they had this major 80th birthday concert for him with like Andreas Vollenweider, with Zucchero, who's like an Italian pop singer.
And were you there with
us?
Alan Parsons?
We were there with the Alan Parsons Live Project, yeah. And we did 2 shows. We did one show that was like an all-star salute to Javan Gasparian, where everybody just played 1 or 2 songs. And then we did a full-length concert on our own like 2 nights later. So we got to spend like 5 days there in Yerevan, the capital. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing, man. It was like one of the most incredible places I've ever been to, you know. And they were wonderful to us, and I got to meet Peter Gabriel.
You got to meet Peter Gabriel.
I've never been so starstruck in my life, man.
Was he wearing the flower costume?
No, he was wearing just like this black coat, and we knew he was going to be there. Because he wasn't performing. He was like I think he just appeared just to make a speech, but you know, and with Parsons we would play these shows and cross paths with people from time to time. You know, if you're on like a festival date or whatever, mm-hmm. you meet him backstage. We did some shows with Jethro Tull. I met Ian Anderson. You know, stuff like that would happen. But he walked past me in the hallway, and I just like, Mr. Gabriel, I'm such a fan. And he was so nice. He was like, "Oh, thank you very much." Yes. And I was like, "Oh, I play bass. I'm with the bass player with Alan Parsons." "Oh, yes. Oh, very good. Yes." Could not have been nicer, but I was just like, doy, you know. And then I saw him again. They gave us a tour of the Ararat cognac factory, which I guess I should tell you about. It's
it sounded very familiar.
Yeah, it's like, I guess it's like the #1 brand of cognac in from Armenia, and so it was, you know, all of the performers on this show, like we had this full day off, and the promoters, I guess they had to do something to keep these people occupied, otherwise they're gonna, you know, destroy the hotel or something. I don't know. So they gave us this like guided tour of the cognac factory. And then it culminated, the tour culminated with this little cocktail reception thing. They had like a band, and people was like sampling the cognac, and Peter Gabriel was there. And so by now, all of us we've all met him already. So so now we figure like we can just walk right up to him. And he recognized us. He's like, "Oh, yes, sure." And so I have a picture somewhere of like me and Peter Gabriel holding up our little shot glasses of cognac.
Damn.
Yeah, it was.
I think you know more about Armenia than I do.
I'll send you a link to a video that I made. I was only able to post it on Facebook. It was too long. I took video for like the whole time I was there, and I made this little video that's like, it was like 10 minutes long, and for whatever reason I had trouble uploading it to YouTube. I can only upload it to Facebook. So I'll send you the link. It was an amazing trip.
Please do.
Sure.
You really threw me off my game when you brought up the carpets.
That wasn't my intention, but it was, you know, when I didn't know who you were, and I heard you mentioned it on one of the shows.
Thank you.
And I thought like, oh, what is that about? And then I Googled the last name, and it was like, oh my God, this guy's like, there's like this whole dynasty that I didn't even know about.
I mean, I'm not really directly involved with the company anymore.
Right.
It's run
Not
by
yet.
no, it's a kind of a different side of the family.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
see.
it was started by my great grandpa. It was ran
Sure.
by my grandpa for like 50 years.
Sure.
But it's Piers Hemmingson, the Canadian author, who I just want to give a quick thank you before I give a proper review of his book tomorrow. I just got it in the mail. He brought the carpets up, which
Really?
I kind of expected because he's out of Toronto. But no other guest has brought that up. So you've earned like triple brownie points.
Wow. Okay. Well.
Anyways,
It's just called research. I like to know who I'm talking to.
I know I've done this research that you speak of about
There you go. Okay. All right.
All right.
So I'm sure there's all kinds of things you're dying to know about me. So
Yeah.
go right ahead.
Well, just kind of a question. Apart from the Beatles these days with the quarantine, what are you listening to?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I must say,
I can't tell if there's
that-
a hint of sarcasm there.
No sarcasm at all. Music has really been crucial to me during this whole thing. It always has been, but mental health is like job one. The beginning of the lockdown was not fun for my wife and I. We were both ill with what we believed to be a mild form of the virus.
Oh, God.
Never been that sick before. I never had any respiratory issues. I wasn't coughing, but I have never experienced fatigue and aches like this before, and fevers. And we're all better now, and it's all good. But one of the few things that got me any relief was listening to music. And there is a stack of CDs in the kitchen by my windowsill, because I would just listen. I'm playing music constantly, and I would just the CDs would pile up, and rather than put them away, I've just been letting them accumulate, and now the stack over like the last, what has it been, April, May, like 2.5 months, the stack is now like getting close to 3 feet high. Wow. And there's a lot of jazz in there, a lot of Miles Davis stuff from all the different facets of his career. In fact, right before this show, I was in the car and I was listening to a set that I have of his that's like the bootleg series from the 1969-1970 band of Jack DeJohnette, Dave Holland, Chick Corea, Miles, and Wayne Shorter. It was a group that did not exist for a very long time. In between the second great quintet that he had with Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, Tony Williams, Ron Carter, between that quintet and the Bitches Brew situation, they did a brief tour of Europe of Miles and Wayne in the front line, and DeJohnette, Chick, and Dave Holland. And that band never recorded officially. But they captured a bunch of shows they did in Europe and put out like a 3-disc set a couple of years ago. So a lot of Miles Davis. It's been running the gamut. Everything from my old standbys like Wendy and Lisa, playing the Eroica album a lot. You're familiar with Donovan?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have his Sutras album from like 1998?
I do not.
Oh, man.
I only have a couple Donovan albums.
Okay.
I need to get more.
Do you have the Wildflowers album by Tom Petty?
No.
Okay. Rick Rubin produced that album.
Really?
And he produced Sutras. And I was going to say, if you know the Wildflowers album by Tom Petty, and the sound that Rick Rubin brought to Tom Petty on that album. If I said to you, it's basically like Donovan's version of the Wildflowers album, then you would understand. It's basically Rick Rubin's production style is basically just to get out of the way, capture everything as dry and as plain as possible. And in Donovan's case, it's like the songwriting is gorgeous and the arrangements are very kind of, I don't want to say sparse, but there's nothing fancy on there. Everything is very dry. There's no not a lot of reverbs and delays and things. You hear the instruments like the way they sound in the room. And about the third or fourth day of the lockdown, I had like chills like you wouldn't believe. I was like, why won't they turn on the heat in this apartment? I was just like shivering. And it was like 2:00 in the afternoon, and I just said, that's it. I'm going to bed. That's how lousy I feel. And I got in bed, and I had like a sweater on and sweatpants and everything, and I bundled up under the blankets, and I put on sutras with the headphones, and it was like, like it just, helped me fall asleep a little bit. So I'm trying to think of some of the other albums that have because I always have music spinning, but there have been a couple of standouts that I've sort of rediscovered recently. I just got a Little Richard CD in the mail.
I think I saw that on Facebook.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. It was one of those things where it occurred to me, I saw the news that he had passed, and I said, I better play some of his music. And then I was like, oh my God, I don't own any Little Richard albums. But he's just one of those guys that you don't think of him in terms of like which albums of his do you own, because he's just one of those, he's just always just existed. He's like part of the ecosystem, like the stars or something like that. So I kind of poked around and I wanted to get because I know it's probably all greatest hits and anthologies and things like that. And I found one called the Georgia Peach, I think. What's the name of this thing? Little Richard, the Georgia Peach, and it came out like 15, 20 years ago, and it's got it's like an hour of stuff. It's got all the hits that you would expect, plus a couple of lesser known tracks. And I had never, again, he's one of those names that you just take for granted. He's just like part of the, he's part of the landscape. But when you focus in and listen to those records and you consider the time that those records were made and what else was going on, what the world was like and what society looked and sounded like, to hear that sound must have really messed with people's minds. You take it for granted, but then you listen to it, I'm like, oh my God, this stuff still sounds like it comes from the future. This guy's like screaming his head off, and it's beautiful and scary all at the same time. You can't put it away,
All I can say is Little Richard is just awesome.
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, but you also got to consider the context. And this is the thing that I find myself doing more and more as I get older, is like listening to the stuff that I love, but then also placing it in the context of the times and think like, man, like when you compare it to what else was going on in the world, like everyone that you talk to about the Beatles who was alive when they were active. I had a guitar player friend of mine, Mick Gaffney, who's an incredible musician. He and I were talking about this, and he said, John, there's no way to describe what it was like every time a new Beatles album came out. It was like a message from the mothership. He said, you can't imagine, like, the new Beatles album is out, and like all of us would just stop whatever we were doing, and you would get the album and just soak it all in. And, I was born in 1972. For me, the whole catalog already existed. There was already solo recordings by the time I was, coming of age. I don't know what it felt like the first time everyone heard Sgt. Pepper, because I've heard that album my whole life, So I've never known a time where that record didn't exist. So the feeling that people must have had the first time they heard Day in the Life. You know, it boggles my mind to think what that must have felt like to
when
people.
it was brand new.
Yeah, and no one had ever heard anything like that. But you and I are young enough to have heard like everyone, you know, copying that record, either being influenced by it or like, you know, actually copying it. You know,
It
doing
was
cover
already
versions of
in
it.
the fabric of music as it is.
Right.
By the time
Right.
we discovered who the Beatles are. Mm-hmm. So it's
Exactly.
hard to kind of contextualize what they kind of brought to the table, so to speak.
You have to work very hard. You have to do a lot of research. I went to Liverpool. Let me rephrase that. My wife and I went to Liverpool 2 summers ago. We were visiting my aunt and uncle in England, and we were going to leave my daughter and, you know, let her stay with my aunt for a few days, and then we were going to go off on our own for 2 days. And my wife was like, well, we should go to Liverpool. We should see your Beatles stuff, you know. And we figured it out, like with the trains and everything like that. And we got there, and we spent 1 night. We spent 2 days and a night there. And it completely changed my entire perception of that band. I thought I knew everything that there was to know about the Beatles, and I knew the music, and I knew the story, and all that kind of stuff. But actually seeing like where they came from, seeing the place where they came from. We did the National Trust tour of Lennon and McCartney's childhood homes. We did another guided tour of like some of the what was the place called? There was a pub near where John went to art college. I'm forgetting the name of the pub.
Not the Casbah.
No, not the Casbah. That's, in fact, I believe the Casbah is actually still open. It's run by the Best family. Mm-hmm. What the hell's the name? Not the Grapes. The Grapes was on Matthew Street near the Cavern. But just seeing where they came from. Oh, I saw. We went to St. Peter's Church, and they showed us that it was part of the tour. This woman, Jackie Spencer, I'll give her a plug because she does these amazing Beatles history tours. We went to St. Peter's Church. She showed me the grass field where Paul saw John playing for the first time. Like, she's like, yeah, so the truck would have been parked about there, and the quarrymen would have been playing on the back of the truck. So then we get to the building of the actual church, right? And I know that inside that building is the sort of the room where they met for the first time. You know, the famous story about how, like, they were on a break, and John and his buddies were hanging out, and Ivan Vaughn walks in. He says, oh, this is my friend Paul. And Paul plays the guitar, and John's like, oh, yeah, what do you do? And he takes the guitar and plays 20 Flight Rock.
By Eddie
Right.
Cochran.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I knew we get up to this building, and there's a plaque on the outside brick wall. And we're walking up, and it's like, can we go in? She goes, well, no, unfortunately. The church still uses the room. You know, it's an active church still. We can't really go in. We're not allowed. And I go, okay. So we're looking at this plaque, and she's talking about, like, you know, so they dedicated the thing as a historical blah, 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 blah. All of a sudden, I see a door open, and this old man, he's probably 75 or something like that. He's pushing a little cart with a bunch of chairs on it, but the door is open to the room. And I'm looking at the door, and I've snuck backstage enough times to know how to be, like, really slick about this kind of stuff. So I start, like, inching my way toward the door.
John, don't say anything incriminating.
There's nothing incriminating. I didn't do it, but let me finish the story.
Okay, sorry.
So now Jackie sees what's up, and the guy's kind of eyeing me, and finally, Jackie goes, do you mind if he just has a look inside? He's flown all the way from New York, and we're on the Beatles tour. And the guy shoots me this look. He goes, there's nothing to see in there. And I go, oh, okay, yeah, but I just, So he holds the door open, and I walk in, and it's like, whoa. On the one hand, it just looks like if you didn't know what it was, you would just think, oh, it's like just this church hall, rec room with like folding tables and stuff. And I guess the week before, they had done some sort of like a dedication of some sort of Beatles history thing where they had like unveiled like something about it. But it's still being used as an actual church, so it's not like a Beatles museum kind of thing. And that's the other thing about the Beatles history stuff in Liverpool, is that they honor the history, but it's like this. It's still like Quarrybank School is still an actual school.
Yeah.
That kids go to, the Jacaranda Club is still open as a functioning club and as like a spot for bands to play in. It's only really the Cavern that has become like a tourist trap. In fact, all of Matthew Street is like, Beatles themed places, and that end of it's a little goofy. But being in the actual room, which is they've probably replaced the floorboards and replaced the sheetrock and everything. There's probably nothing original in that room from when it was in 57. But just being in that space was just like, whoa, man, but seeing where they came from provided me with a certain amount of insight into their character. And put it this way, I thought that I was going to go to Liverpool and pick up some of that Beatles mojo, right? Mm-hmm. What I found was it's the Beatles that have Liverpool mojo. There's a whole vibe in Liverpool that's, so when the Beatles came to America and they did their press conference at the airport, right? The New York press was, they went. This is all, part of the story. I'm sure you know this.
Yeah.
The New York press hated them. These long-haired freaks from England,
and they weren't expecting them to be as kind of strong-willed as they were. No, they sing like girls, for Christ's sake. Woo! And they don't even know how to read music, for Christ's sakes. Yeah.
And so that natural sort of snarkiness that the press has against any sort of craze like that. So they all went down to the airport to do the press conference, and the New York City press was we're going to rip these English, so-and-sos, we're going to rip them apart. What they didn't figure on was that these guys had cut their teeth in strip clubs in Hamburg.
Oh, yeah.
Playing for sailors and prostitutes, right? And these guys, those guys got off the plane ready for blood also. So they gave that attitude right back at them. If you saw where Ringo grew up, I saw Ringo's street
on the tour.
It's the hood, man. It's like still, So a guy came up from those kinds of streets. He's not taking any shit, and they threw it right back in their faces. And a friend of mine who you should absolutely have on the show here, Roseanne Beluso.
Okay.
She actually has a fan club called Fans on the Run.
Oh.
Any place on the Eastern Seaboard that McCartney plays, she's there.
I think I actually saw them.
Yeah, she's been invited on stage with Paul more than once, actually. And she's from Brooklyn, like I am. And I was asking, and I know she's been to Liverpool a bunch of times, so I had called her about, like, who should I talk to? Where should I go? Is there, like, an organized, getting, the advice on, like, what I should do. And she basically said, like, Liverpool is like the Brooklyn of England. Working class, but also there's, like, a sophistication there. A lot of poets, a lot of artists, and there's a certain kind of vibe in there. And seeing the streets that they walked on, seeing the route from we stayed at this in what they call the city center,
Okay.
which is like close to where the cavern is and everything, and we figured out the bus route out to the place where the National Trust tours were starting from, and we're in the McCartney home, and we're sitting on in the living room there, and does anybody have any questions? I said, yeah. So you're telling me that Paul lived in this house until he was 21? So when they were playing the cavern, how did they get there? And it sounds like a silly question, but how did they physically get from here? Now that I've seen what the actual distance is from their house to the cavern, how did they? I just was curious about the logistics of that. How did they actually get there? And she's like, they took the bus. I said, what? I said, yeah, they would get on the bus with their instruments and everything, and they had to, and I think they had to switch buses or something. And having taken that bus route myself and seeing what it was like, you don't think of these things when you read those stories, but you understand how the deck was just completely stacked against them at every step. Every level of the video game, it got tougher and tougher and tougher until they were on the Ed Sullivan Show in America, just completely reorganizing culture. Right,
Because
they were just—it's like any number of bands coming up in that scene that had hipper song choices, better musicianship, da 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 da. But these guys, the brass balls that it took to come from where they came from to become what they became, it makes their story even more supernatural.
Because is Ringo's house? When did you go back to Liverpool?
I was there we were there the summer of 2018. It's 2 summers ago.
Okay. When I was there was this big stink because Ringo's house was going to be torn down, and so
Right.
I saw his house quite decrepit and abandoned, and
Yes.
but it just made me kind of think that how could these borderline Dickensian street kids from Liverpool
Right.
go on to have the biggest impact on music since Beethoven?
Right. Well, exactly. That's was the whole train ride home. Home, I should say, back to where my aunt and uncle live. The whole train ride out of there, I just was like, I put on Strawberry Fields Forever on my iPod, and suddenly it all made sense. Seeing where they all came from, seeing George's house, just seeing what those. I mean, so you were there, so you know what I'm talking about. The way those streets looked, and the fact that nobody is really impressed with anything there, like the people that are from there anyway. I think the tourists, they see people like me, and I was really conscious not to be like yet another irritating American Beatles freak wanting to see Ringo's house or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But it brought the story. I mean, I've been reading those books since I was, younger than you. Shout by Philip Norman, or The Beatles Forever, the Hunter Davies book. I've been reading those books my whole life, but seeing the actual Penny Lane and the actual Strawberry
still
Fields
gives me chills thinking about it.
But it really brought the story to life, because I've been in bands with my friends and dreamed of making it. It's different growing up in New York. When you live like an hour away from Radio City Music Hall, it's not, it's the different kind of thing. But Liverpool is sort of like, it's a different vibe. It's like its own little. I mean, all the different sections of England, as I found out, are very, European cities in general, I think, it's very regional. I remember when my wife and I honeymooned in Italy, and all the different, even like within a place like Siena, there are like these little neighborhoods, these little enclaves that have their own flags and their own sort of take on things. In Liverpool, there's definitely like a vibe. And we were saying, like, you know, we're walking around the streets, and I said to Jill, I said, what does this remind you of? Does it remind you of like downtown New York? Does it remind you of London? Of Paris? You know, she's traveled with me a bunch when I was on tour. I said, what does this remind you of? And she goes, you know what? It's its own thing. Liverpool is totally its own thing. And we finished the visit with, we went to the Liverpool Museum, which is down by the docks, down by the water. And they had a huge John and Yoko exhibit. And we saw the part of the exhibit where he's doing the bed in for peace, and there's like a film of him like mouthing off to some reporter or whatever, getting back and forth, you know, having this like back and forth with the reporter, and he's got the cigarette, and he's like scowling at this guy. Yeah, well, the French have been blah, 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 and he's just getting in the guy's face. And having seen his Aunt Mimi's house and knowing that he grew up he spent his youth like as an adolescent kid, he grew up in a house where, you know, Mimi was, when her husband died, when John's Uncle George died, she had to find all kinds of ways to make money. And one of the ways that she used to make money was she would rent out rooms in her house to college students. So John was living in the house, but then there was like this revolving crew of these college students, medical students and veterinary students and, you know, intellectuals coming and going in the house. And it suddenly made perfect sense to me that a kid who grew up in an environment like that would go on to become, you know, who John Lennon was in 1969. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Or am I talking too much?
Oh, no, it makes sense.
Yeah. No, it really brought the story to life to me, and it made the music make more sense because I understood their mentality a little bit more. That restlessness artistically of like, what else can we do? Like you never saw them like, all right, well, we owe them one more album, so let's just crank out a bunch of songs that sound like Beatles songs and call it a day. There was always like, well, what else? What can we do to like stretch this thing out? What new sound have we not used yet? You know, and that goes back to like Hard Day's Night. We're like, why don't you play the bongos instead or something like that? You know what I mean? Yeah. So that kind of constantly pushing the limits, trying stuff that hadn't been done yet. You know, when you go to Liverpool and you see, you get the feeling in those streets, you kind of understand that sort of like artistic kind of restlessness and that, you know, that sort of seeking something that's got some character to it, and the humor, the dry humor. I remember there was when we did the National Trust tours, the driver was a Liverpudlian, and there were these two people, and they went over to ask the driver a question, and they had like these very thick accents, and he goes, well, listen, I don't speak Spanish, you're going to be waiting quite a long time for an answer. And he goes, oh, we are not Spanish, we are Norwegian. And the driver goes, well, you'll be waiting even longer then. Right? And I thought it just sounded like dialogue out of Hard Day's Night. He was just so quick with it, and I really understood, like, oh, that's the character, you know, that's the character that was in that group. And if you look at like their humor and their sort of irreverence for things, I think that is what really struck a chord with us in America, particularly in New York and particularly in Brooklyn. You know, a lot of like the really heavy beatards like myself it's this phenomenon where there's like something about like Italian American men from Brooklyn and from New York City, not just Brooklyn, but like Long Island and everything. Like a lot of the heavy beatards that I know are guys like me. All the Beatle tribute bands are Tony Garofalo, Mike Bellucci, like the guys like me. And I said, what is it about the Beatles that attracts Italian men like that. And I think it's that sort of like that quick wit is very similar to how we are in Brooklyn. It's a working class thing.
I don't even know what to say because you just... No, it's not a rant. It's... I don't know how I could have put anything better.
I forget the original... So to answer your question, what have I been listening to? Lots of stuff. and not... Interestingly enough, not a whole lot of Beatles. I gotta say, I don't listen to a ton of Beatles because it's, I've been listening to those records my whole life, and I try not...
You don't want them to get stale.
Correct. But I will say this, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, a week ago, I think it was a Saturday morning, I got up to make breakfast, and I was in the kitchen, and for some reason, I thought, I'm going to put Rubber Soul on. And I prefer American Rubber Soul, just because it's the one I grew up with. I don't know how you feel about it. I know people get very uptight about the English records or the, it's the way the band intended them to sound.
I don't have a particularly strong opinion on it. I mean, because the music's great either way.
Exactly.
I mean, I think it's just how you're used to hearing it.
I think, that's exactly. So for me, Rubber Soul has to open with I've Just Seen a Face.
And for me, it has to open with Drive My Car.
Okay, that's fine. And the English Rubber Soul album is a great album. I'm not knocking it.
But it's not the same album.
It's a completely different album. I think Dave Dexter at Capitol Records has gotten a lot of flack over the years. For people accuse him of like tampering with stuff, which is slightly dubious. I don't think the Beatles were in there selecting the running order of anything. A, and B, given what his job description was at that time, he was perfectly within his rights to set up those records any way that he saw fit. His job was to make sure that those records sold. You know what I mean? It wasn't like someone else got in there and started messing, and rewriting the songs or re-editing them. I think if the English Rubber Soul album had been released in America in 1965, I don't think it would have had the same impact. And the American Rubber Soul album opens with it's much more acoustic. It's much folkier.
It's the album that inspired Pet Sounds, not the British version.
Thank you. It inspired Pet Sounds. When you talk about acts like the Byrds or Tom Petty or any number of these American bands who come straight directly out of the Beatles playbook, they were listening to those Capitol albums. So I understand that the English versions, it's more bang for your buck. They don't repeat the singles. They're longer, all that kind of business, and that's fine. But for me personally, I have a special connection to American Rubber Soul. So anyway, I put it on in the kit. Yeah, I'm sorry. Dave.
Oh no, you go ahead. You started first.
Okay. Well, no, I was just saying I put it on in the kitchen, and I've listened to that record my whole life. It's nothing, not going to discover anything new, but these days, like I said, I don't listen to it that often. And I was like, oh my God, how do they do this? For some reason, like now, out of, after how many years, now it's striking me like, how do they, just one amazing song after another? They were just on fire, and it's nice to kind of hear them, to put it away for a while so you hear it fresh, and that you don't get tired of it and that you don't take it for granted. And I was just blown away, like, all over again, And again, I thought to myself, man, in 1965, like, what else was going on? Like, all the other bands. When this record came out, how many bands went, shit, we better go back to the drawing board, man. They've raised the bar again. You know, I also have there's like a couple of songs on the like "It's Only Love" is one of those like underrated, underappreciated.
I love that song.
Yeah, and no bridge. Verse, chorus, out. I don't think that song's even 2 minutes long.
It took me like a million years to figure out what that guitar sound was.
Yeah.
And I think it was just, like the Gretsch with the Bigsby just hammering on that one string while another guitar was playing like the descending notes.
Right. Yeah,
But
I definitely think... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's just something seemingly that simple, but it's so kind of complex. Even just a riff like that.
Yes, and the purpose that it serves, for the lead guitarist in the band to expand, all of them individually, I think, expanded the role that their instrument would play in the context of a band. Much in the same way that Miles Davis's quintets, small groups, would, if you listen to the Miles group from, the earlier days with, oh man, why do I do this? I start talking like I know what I'm talking about, and then I forget everyone's name. So, but that's okay. I'm sitting in front of the computer, and I can just look it up while I'm talking. And then they'll think, yeah, man, that guy knows what he's talking about. Okay, so the group that played on Kind of Blue. Cannonball Adderley on alto sax, John Coltrane on tenor.
I'm just
Bill
impressed,
Evans
and you knew these off the top of your head.
No, I didn't. I'm looking at Wikipedia. But, okay.
That was the joke.
So you've got... So the rhythm section was Jimmy Cobb, Paul Chambers, and Wynton Kelly. And there's... and Bill Evans. And the horns were, besides Miles, is Cannonball Adderley and John Coltrane. Okay. Completely different... when he got the quintet together with Herbie Hancock, Tony Williams, and Ron Carter. Those three guys in the rhythm section were doing things on their instrument that like that hadn't been done yet. They were expanding the role that those instruments could play. Suddenly the drums didn't have to be the timekeeper necessarily. Bass didn't have to play the root of the chord on the downbeat all the time, right? And so a lead guitarist like George Harrison didn't have to just wait for the middle eight to take a solo. Now he was like orchestrating parts. Now he was like composing counter melodies and taking more care to structure them in a way that they were, a second element to the song, a second dimension to the song. And if it meant double tracking it or putting it through a Leslie or like hitting the Bigsby, like you said, just to keep it interesting, so that because don't forget, ultimately you're going to put this thing on your stereo, and you're going to go, what is that? Like just the sound, like that song pops out at you, and you go, my God, what is that? Like if you hear the version of It's Only Love on the anthology where it's just the acoustic, it's fine.
Yeah, but it doesn't hit the same way.
When that sound comes out, you're like, what is that?
Yeah.
And whatever happens next, you're waiting for it. Like what's going to happen now? And I think they were brilliant at coming up with things that just making things sound interesting. And just to catch your ear. It's ear candy, but then now you're paying full attention.
Another song
that's
like
why
that.
that song, yeah, and that's why It's Only Love can do what it needs to do in under 2 minutes. A bridge would have ruined that song. If there was another section to that song, it would have collapsed. you know. So they do just what's necessary, in, out, done, next, you know. And that I heard that song again, like I said, like a week ago. I was like, oh my God, you know, how did they, you know, what that must have been like in 1965 to get an album from a band where every single track is just like pow, 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 like one after the next, you know.
I was going to say another song that kind of evokes that same kind of feeling is I Need You off the Help album with that.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's a volume pedal.
Yes. I think it's volume. I think there's guys who know more about this kind of stuff than I do. I think he had a volume and tone pedal.
There's Andy Babiuk when you need him.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. It's you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I think it was a thing where if you moved it up and down, it was volume, and it moved it side to side, it would change the tone. So I think, yes, it is. He's changing the tone as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I Need You is one of those songs that, like, you know, it's one of those George songs that people don't really talk about very much for some reason. It just gets lost in the shuffle when people talk about Here Comes the Sun or While My Guitar Gently Weeps, you know, which are all great, but like those songs where George was definitely trying to like elbow his way into the club. You know what I mean? I mean,
yeah.
It's, to be in a band with Lennon and McCartney must have been a lot of like, you know, how am I going to like edge my way into this game, you know? And I Need You is a gem. And he wasn't afraid to try out like new chords. Although my two favorite George tracks are, I was going to say my favorite George track, but I have two of them: Old Brown Shoe,
I love
and Think for Yourself.
Oh,
we
Think
were
for
supposed
Yourself is awesome.
we were supposed to do a show in March. It's a band I work with here in New York, Wondrous Stories, and we were going to do a concert. They were doing it the last 10 years or so. We've been doing this concert for Bangladesh Revisited, where it's like a cast of like, you know, 25, 30 people, and we do the set list from the Bangladesh concert, and then we do like a second set of like selected Beatles tracks and solo tracks, and then we'll have like star guests come up, and Steve Holley from Wings has been on there a couple of times, Marshall Crenshaw, people like that that we are sort of in our orbit, and they'd asked me to do it again this year, and I knew that we would, you know, we try to fill out the set with other George songs, and I said, I'll do it if I can do Think for Yourself, and I want to sing it, and I want to play the fuzz bass.
Oh, the fuzz bass is killer.
And they said, yeah, okay, because it was one that we hadn't tried yet. And we had it all worked out. We were going to have, like, I was going to play fuzz bass, and we had a bass player worked out to play the regular bass part, and we had the harmonies all worked out, and then the show had to be canceled because of the pandemic, you know. But, and I had figured out how to get the fuzz bass sound. I have a Tech 21 pedal called the VT bass. It's like it's supposed to replicate like the distortion you get from an SVT rig.
Okay.
And I had just figured out the exact setting to get like the fuzz where it didn't distort too much, but there was some sustain, but it still cut through. But I had to play my violin bass with flat wounds.
Oh yeah.
To do it, you know. And I was all psyched to do, and I had worked out like playing the fuzz bass line and singing. I had it all worked out, and I was, you know, but then the show didn't happen. So
do it virtually. I want to hear this.
Yeah, you know what? I might just have to do that. I think you're right.
You know, if you need drums.
Well, if you want to do the drums and you send them to me, that will get the ball rolling. That will definitely get the ball rolling because I can't do drums here. I actually, you know what? I was thinking about that. Like after the Bangladesh show got canceled, and you know, you should know it was like the day before. I mean, it was in New York. I don't know what it was like in the rest of the world, but in New York, it was right up until the last minute. It was like that Wednesday of that week when the president addressed the nation about like this pandemic is pretty gnarly after all. It was like Thursday, and people were still, but not really sure what was happening. It was like, nope, all the Broadway theaters are closed now. What? Oh yeah, and now there's no baseball. What? Like one by one, the dominoes kept falling. We were supposed to play this show. It was supposed to be Friday the 13th, and it was Thursday that we got the email saying, yeah, the venue is they don't want to do the show. But up until that Thursday morning, I thought, like, am I going to be driving tomorrow night to do a show with 30 people on stage and people sharing mics and everything? I don't think so.
God, I missed live entertainment.
Well, you know what? That was the live entertainment's my bread and butter, my friend. So, of all the things that they used to warn me about how unstable a career in music is, lots of factors come into play here, but the notion that, like, didn't ever occur to us that baked into your business model is large groups of people assembling in a small place. And if that ever becomes a problem, then that's it, my friend. And we've been learning how to deal with the changing face of media and tastes and upheavals in the business and all these kinds of things. But no one ever prepared us for, like, one day we're going to be limited to gatherings of no more than 10 people at a time.
That's not even like half your band.
That's right. I mean, that was, look, the Bangladesh show, we have like 9 singers on stage. They really, the guys in Wondrous Stories really, they go all out. We have 2 drummers, a percussionist, there's like 4 guitar players. Because anytime you do a George tribute thing, the band's got to be 27 people,
Yeah.
And we have like a 9-voice, vocal choir. It's like a huge undertaking, And I said, there's no way that this is going to happen. And sure enough, then it got postponed all the way till May. They thought May 8th we're going to do it. I'm like, oh, okay. And then, of course, now it's sort of been held off indefinitely. But in any case, we're getting way off the Beatles track here. So,
I just want to add one.
What else would you like to know?
One little tangent.
Sure.
About live music. This will probably destroy my viewers' respect for me. When all these concerts were getting canceled, and I got the email that the Kraftwerk concert I was going to go see got postponed till next year, I almost put my fist through a wall.
Oh, wow. Well, now, so let's break this down for a second.
Not the band you would associate with putting a fist through a wall.
Well, again, look, it's why do you think that your fans, your listeners, would lose any sort of respect for you about that? Because it's a first world problems kind of thing, or are you maintaining this public image of being like totally chill all the time, and you don't want people to know that you've got such a hot temper?
Bit of both.
Why would people? Okay, so I think listen, man. As I'm 48 years old, I'm looking to the younger generation because they are going to be running the country when I'm 90 years old and having to be fed with a spoon. So I take a lot of interest in what young people are doing and what they're into. And for a 17-year-old to be that heavily into a band like Kraftwerk is pretty hip.
Kraftwerk's
in and of
awesome.
itself. Yeah, and I must say I don't know anything about them, but I know sort of what they're about. It's like German, like electronic stuff, right? Okay, I think it's pretty cool that you're hip enough to be disappointed like that. And by the way, and I know this sounds like I'm condescending, and I don't mean it to be, so I apologize in advance.
No,
but I remember
no
being
offense.
I remember being 17 years old and how that kind of shit was like life and death.
Yeah.
To me, this, to this day, when I harbor a little bit of resentment about there was a show that I wanted to see when I was 16. It was the summer of 1988. Squeeze was playing at Jones Beach.
Okay.
And the Smithereens were opening.
Oh.
And I was like Smithereens fan one. I mean, that was like, we could do a whole other podcast about my relationship with the Smithereens. And I loved Squeeze. So the two of them on a show together was like, I had to be at that show. And I had taken a job at a sleepaway camp in Connecticut. It was the camp that I had been going to for like the previous couple of years. And now I was going back as like a counselor aide, right? Like a junior counselor. And there was no way for me to get from like the camp was like a half-hour drive to the train station. And so I would have to take a train home and then get out to Jones Beach somehow. And we lived in Brooklyn. Jones Beach is out in Long Island. And there was no way that I was going to be able to like get to that show, to get away from the camp. And I was just furious. Just like that kind of just, I mean, I was so mad and so pissed off that I was going to be missing this like once in a lifetime show. And, finally my father said, listen, next time the Smithereens come to town, I will take you to see them. Okay. Whenever that is, you just let me know and I will do that. And I was like, okay. And that October they played at the Beacon Theater and they were headlining. And I went, and that was the show that changed my life. That was the show that I said, I want to be in the rock and roll business. Whatever that is going on down there, I want a piece of that. So it turned out okay. And then I did get to see Squeeze again, I think the following year they played the Garden, and I saw them.
I'm going to divert
I remember,
back to the Beatles. Oh, wait, no.
Please. No, that was it. That was it.
I feel bad because I feel like I keep interrupting.
No, it's fun. No, you know what it is? I think this clean feed is maybe this. It sounds great, but I think there might be a little bit of that sort of lag that happens. So, in any case, what else you got about the Beatles?
When did you first discover the Beatles?
I was from the time I was born. I mean, my parents were massive fans, particularly my father. My father was a guitar player, still is. My mother's a concert pianist. They were actually in a band together for a time. I think like right before I was born and until I was like maybe like a year old or so. It was just always around. And my folks divorced when I was maybe, I think like 2 or something. And we would stay at my dad's place from time to time. And he just had the records around. I mean, my mother had the albums too. But my father had like his guitars would be out. And he was just a much more of a pronounced kind of fan. And I got to say, thinking about this, he had a book called The Beatles: An Illustrated Record.
I know the one I know the one you speak of.
Okay, so when I was like 4 years old, 5 years old, I was always up earlier than everyone else. I would always wake up like before my sister or my dad or whatever. And I can remember like thumbing through this book and looking at all the pictures and how they, how the way they looked changed over the years. It was just like so fascinating visually. But again, he had those records. He used to play those songs on guitar. And, growing up in America in the 70s, they were still all over the radio, all over TV. I mean, they were still pretty ubiquitous then. So I don't remember there being like a moment where I got into them. They were just always there. You know, I hear stories about when I was in like nursery school, and I used to carry the Strawberry Fields Penny Lane single around with me, like 4 years old, 5 years old, going to kindergarten, and like, you know, I remember that orange and yellow swirl capital label of that single. And then I went through a very serious Let It Be phase when I was like 6, like kindergarten, first grade was like, I was obsessed with the Let It Be album.
Really?
Yeah. Again, I mean, just when you're a kid, think of being 6 years old and like looking at the Let It Be album, like with the big gatefold cover and those pictures, those in the little frames. It's like a comic book, you know, and they're on the roof and they're in this like the big film studio with mics everywhere. It was just, I just remember being captivated by like the imagery of, you know, of where they were. It just seemed so magical and what they were doing. And the music was just already part of the landscape. It wasn't like this thing that you had to go off and secretly do without your parents' knowledge, because my parents were into it too, and my parents' friends. Like every time we would go visit someone, you know, we'd go to someone's house, whether it was my uncle's house or like my parents had friends who also had kids our age, and so we would all get together, and you go to someone's house and you walk into the living room and you walk over to the record player and there's a copy of Sgt. Pepper or the Red and Blue album. I mean, like every home that I was in, you know, from the time I was 12 years old, owned a copy of Sgt. Pepper. I mean, it was like the Bible or something, or the phone book. I mean, it was just everywhere, you know. So it wasn't like I had to work very hard to pursue this interest. It was only when I started reading the books and getting into the history, like, you know, like Shout and those kinds of books, we're learning this, you know, the story about Hamburg and Brian Epstein and NEMS Enterprises and Apple and Alan Klein and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Then it became a thing where I was more of like, you know, geeking out on it. And then then once the anthology came out and hearing like that much more detail about the story, I got more geeked out on it. And then I started, when I got the gig with Alan Parsons, and through working with him, we started doing these things where, you know, we would start backing up guys like Joey Molland and Denny Lane, and then I started meeting people that were in their orbit and hearing these stories firsthand, you know, and finding out more about the kind of people that they were. And it just seems like every different points in my life where the interest, it wasn't like my interest would wane or increase. It was I heard a quote once about learning, where there's two ways to learn. You can either put more information into your head, or you can take the information that's already there and reheat it so it expands. And for me, that's kind of what was happening with the Beatles and continues to happen. Like when I would sit with Denny Lane and he would tell me things, firsthand stuff about McCartney, about the way they did stuff, that it would sort of give me another it would provide me like there's like another facet to his character that would explain why certain creative decisions were made. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
So, you know, there have been different points in my life where, you know, where you think to yourself, God, with the Beatles already, enough. Like, when is he going to be tired of this stuff? No, when you find out things like how the Hey Jude album was assembled in New York by Alan Klein, you know, it just, like I've loved that album my whole life, but then you find out that it was like, we need product because like we just signed a deal with Capitol, but
Made
John
by
says
Satan himself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what was he going to do? He just negotiated, you know that story, right?
The biggest like royalty increase up to that point with Capitol Records.
25 cents a record, up from 18 cents a record. But check it out. So they were getting 18 cents a record. He negotiated it up to 25. Okay? How many more cents is that?
Don't do this to
7.
me. I didn't do well in math.
Don't they teach maths up there in Ontario? 25 minus...
Just math.
Okay.
My brain,
so that's...
I'm working at about 10% normal capacity.
That's okay. That's all right. Oh, that's so funny.
No, essential personnel only.
That's hysterical. Okay, so so the 7-cent increase. Okay, so are you familiar with a McCartney book called Many Years From Now?
Is Ethan familiar with the McCartney book called Many Years From Now? Will they derail the conversation and start talking about non-Beatles music? Does any of this matter? Tune in Monday for the thrilling conclusion to this episode. Same fan time, same fan channel.